Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's EBC. We're at St. John's University at the St. John's Abbey this week, and we're here actually having nothing to do with this particular place, but having to do with a stadium that's down the hill, because we were here visiting my son and our lovely daughter-in-law throwing for their track and field team. And I want to think about that from the standpoint of this week's verses, because nowadays, if we sort of let our kids off into the world, we follow them around a little bit, we come cheer for them at track meets, we connect with them while they're at their jobs, whatever it is, we have a lot to do with our kids. But this week's story is the parable of the prodigal son. And it's Jesus talking about this parable and teaching us with it. Now, in this parable, Jesus talks about a man who gives half of what he has to his younger son when his younger son demands it, and then leaves his older son to do all of the work, while the younger son goes off and then spends all of the money and winds up with nothing. And then when a famine comes, he has nothing and has to get a job tending pigs, and eventually he decides that his life is so terrible that he would be better off if he simply went back to his father and said, "Father, don't call me your son anymore, just hire me as one of your servants, and then at least I will have bread." So that's what the son decides to do. He returns to his father, and his father, of course, sees him coming from a long way off, embraces him, throws the grandest party for him, and then the older son comes and says, "Wait a minute, I've been here this whole time. Why are we throwing a party for the son who has squandered half of everything?" And of course, his father says, "We had to celebrate simply because what was lost now is found." And this is one of the most well-known parables in all of the Bible, and it gets a lot of treatments from folks thinking about the younger son and what the younger son was thinking and doing, and the older son and whether the older son was justified or not justified. I actually want to think about this from the standpoint of the dad for a moment, because I want to think about the way the dad shows God's grace in ways that are really, truly amazing. So first, where does the story start? The story starts when the son, rather impertinently, comes up to the dad and says, "Give me half of everything." And there's nothing in the parable that says that the dad paused or thought or was worried. He just gave. And then the son, of course, goes off to wherever the son is going to go to squander all of this money. And if you think about the dad in that instance, the dad has sort of let his son out into the world, given all the gifts that he can, and then he just sort of lets what's going to happen next happen. And we don't know whether he followed him, from a distance, kind of learning what it was he was doing, or whether he had no idea where he was at all. But the answer is he let his son go out and do whatever the son was going to do, make the mistakes, commit the sins that he was going to before he eventually comes back. And that too is a lot like God, sort of giving us all of our gifts and then sort of letting us do what we're going to do, letting us experience our faith and our faith journey. And then, of course, when the son comes back, this is the most interesting part of the story, because the son comes back and the father sees the son from a long way off. And I want to pause for just a moment to think about this from the standpoint of the way we would do this if we were parents watching a kid come back after having done all of that this son is described as doing, right? What's one potential reaction? Well, let's talk about the behavioral psychologist for a moment. The parent that says, "Well, I certainly can't reward this sort of behavior, so what I need to do is, be stern, and you know what, I will take him up on his offer. He should be a servant for a while, and it's for his own good because he'll learn to do better." But that is not God's reaction. God has just abounding grace, love, forgiveness, and welcomeness, right? Or the father could be somebody who thinks about that parent peer group. What is everyone else going to think of me as a parent if I just let this slide? Perhaps I need to do something just so that I look good to all of the neighbors. Doesn't happen at all, right? God is still there, just being as gracious and abundant as possible. And then the one that the story really talks about, what happens if other people think they've been treated unfairly because of how generous I've been to this son. And of course, it is the older son that comes and complains and says he's been there and he's done everything. And how can it be that we're throwing a party for this sort of behavior? And yet, this isn't a pie. as we like to talk about it. God's grace is not one pie that he doles out pieces to and he runs out. So when the son comes and says, what about me? The son's thinking about God giving away pieces of grace as though the son won't get any or will get less, because God is giving away grace and forgiveness and abundance to the younger son. And so as we think about this, what we think about God's grace in this parable, what we think about Jesus spending time with sinners in this parable, is not a parable about he's going to do things for sinners at the expense of others. We think about this as God giving grace abundantly because it won't run out, because it is for everyone, and because he shows us he loves us unconditionally and always. Everyone, have a great week.